What's up everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating yet criminally overlooked warriors in the entire Song of Ice and Fire universe. This is a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall, who laughed in the face of his enemies while crushing them in combat, and who literally declared himself king and went to war against the Iron Throne over a matter of honor. I'm talking about Lyonel Baratheon, better known as the Laughing Storm, and trust me when I say that by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this guy deserves way more recognition than he gets. Now, if you're a fan of the upcoming HBO series A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, you're going to see Lyonel portrayed by Daniel Ings, and I genuinely cannot wait to see this character brought to life. But before we get there, we need to talk about who this man really was, what made him such an incredible warrior, and why his story is absolutely essential to understanding the Baratheon lineage that eventually produces Robert, Stannis, and Renly. So let's get into it. Lyonel Baratheon lived during one of the most interesting periods in Westerosi history, a time roughly a century before the events of Game of Thrones. He was the Lord of Storm's End and head of House Baratheon during the reign of King Aegon V, better known as Aegon the Unlikely. And if you've read the Duncan Egg novellas, you'll know that Aegon V is actually the young Squire Egg who travels with Sir Duncan the Tall. Keep that connection in mind, because it becomes incredibly important to Lyonel's story. Now, when we're talking about Lyonel's physical presence, we need to understand that this man was an absolute giant. He had the classic Baratheon features, black hair and blue eyes, but he was described as being a head taller than most men and nearly as tall as Sir Duncan the Tall himself, who stood at roughly 6'11". That means Lyonel was somewhere in the neighborhood of 6'8" to 6'10", and he was powerfully built with broad shoulders and massive strength. Contemporary accounts describe him as a swaggering giant of a man, and that's not hyperbole. This was someone whose physical presence alone could dominate a room. But what really set Lyonel apart wasn't just his size, it was his personality. He earned the nickname the Laughing Storm because of his habit of laughing, loudly and boisterously, at his opponents during tourneys and battles. Imagine facing someone who's nearly 7 feet tall, who's about to knock you off your horse, and who's laughing like it's the funniest thing in the world. That psychological warfare combined with genuine skill made him absolutely terrifying to face in combat. But here's the thing, the small folk absolutely loved him for it. That laughter wasn't cruel or mocking, it was joyous. He genuinely loved the thrill of combat, and that infectious enthusiasm made him a massive favorite among the common people. Our first real glimpse of Lyonel in action comes from the tourney at Ashford Meadow in 209 AC, which is the setting for the first Duncan Egg novella, The Hedge Knight. At this point, Lyonel was still the heir to Storm's End, not yet the Lord, but he was already establishing himself as one of the finest fighters of his generation. The tourney was held in honor of the 13th name day of Lord Ashford's daughter, and all the great houses sent their champions. In his first tilt, Lyonel challenged Sir Robert Ashford, one of the champions defending the fair maid. Now, this wasn't some quick victory. These two warriors were so evenly matched that they broke 9 lances against each other. 9 lances. For those who don't know medieval tournament protocol, that's extraordinary. Most tilts would be decided in 3 or 4 passes, but after that 10th course, both men lost their saddles and crashed to the ground. And here's where it gets even better. Instead of calling it a draw, they both rose and continued fighting on foot, sword against mace. Eventually, a battered and exhausted Robert Ashford admitted defeat, and Lyonel became a champion of the tourney. But the really interesting part of the Ashford tourney wasn't Lyonel's initial victory, it was what happened next. Throughout the tourney, Lyonel fought multiple matches against lesser opponents, and he developed this signature move that made him legendary. The moment any challenger touched his shield, he would break into that booming laughter. While he was mounting, charging, and knocking them from their stirrups, he'd be laughing the entire time. And if his opponent was wearing any kind of crest on their helm, Lyonel would strike it off with his lance and fling it into the crowd. These crests were often made of enamel, gilt, or even silver, so the small folk would scramble to catch them. The common people loved this. They thought he was the greatest entertainment they'd ever seen. The knights he defeated, however, were considerably less amused, and eventually only crestless men were willing to challenge him. Then came the incident that would define the tourney and, in many ways, change the course of Westerosi history. A hedge knight named Duncan the Tall struck Prince Aegon Targaryen, defending a Dornish puppeteer named Tansel from the prince's cruelty. This led to Duncan being arrested and facing a trial of 7, one of the rarest and most sacred forms of trial by combat in Westeros. It's essentially a 7-on-7 battle where each side represents the 7 faces of God, and there hadn't been one in over 100 years. Here's where we really get to see what kind of man Lyonel Baratheon was. Duncan the Tall's squire, a boy named Egg, who was actually Prince Aegon Targaryen in disguise, came to Lyonel to ask for his help. Now, Lyonel didn't know Duncan personally, and he had no particular reason to risk his life for a hedge knight accused of striking a prince. But when this young boy, who would later become King Aegon V, slipped between the legs of Lyonel's own squire and poured a flagon of wine over his head to get his attention, Lyonel was impressed by the kid's audacity. And what does Lyonel say? He says, and I'm paraphrasing here from the text, "There has not been a trial of 7 for more than 100 years. Do you know that? I was not about to miss a chance to fight the Kingsguard knights and tweak Prince Maekar's nose in the bargain." This tells us so much about Lyonel. First, he was someone who lived for the challenge, for the glory of combat. He wasn't motivated by politics or careful calculation. He wanted to fight the best warriors in the realm, and this was his chance. Second, he had a bit of a rebellious streak. Prince Maekar was Egg's father, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and Lyonel was essentially saying he wanted to annoy him just for the fun of it. Before the trial began, there was another moment that showed Lyonel's character. Sir Raymun Fossaway needed to be knighted to participate in the trial, and Duncan, being a hedge knight himself, was hesitant to perform the ceremony. Lyonel stepped in and knighted Raymun on the spot, giving him the qualification to fight. This wasn't something he had to do. It was an act of generosity and understanding that showed Lyonel wasn't just a warrior. He was someone who understood honor and who would help others achieve their potential. The trial of 7 itself was brutal. Prince Baelor Targaryen, the heir to the throne, was killed during the combat, but Duncan's side emerged victorious, and Duncan was declared innocent. Lyonel had fought alongside one of the greatest knights of his age and helped secure justice for a hedge knight who had nothing to offer in return. This created a bond between Lyonel and both Duncan and Egg that would echo through the decades. Fast forward some years, and Lyonel has become Lord of Storm's End. That young squire Egg has become King Aegon V Targaryen, and that hedge knight Duncan has risen to become Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Think about that trajectory. The 3 of them met when Egg was pouring wine over people's heads, when Duncan was fighting for his life, and when Lyonel was just looking for a good fight. Now, one rules the 7 kingdoms, one commands the king's personal guard, and one lords over one of the most powerful regions in Westeros. Lyonel proved to be one of King Aegon's most loyal supporters. Their friendship, forged in that trial by 7 decades earlier, remained strong. Aegon was known as the Unlikely because he never expected to become king, and his reign was marked by attempts to improve conditions for the small folk and reform the realm. Having a powerful lord like Lyonel Baratheon as a staunch ally was crucial to these efforts. The friendship between Aegon and Lyonel was so strong that when the king wanted to betroth his eldest son and heir, Prince Duncan Targaryen, to secure an important alliance, he chose Lyonel's daughter. This wasn't just a political match, it was a personal one, a joining of 2 houses bound by genuine friendship and mutual respect. For House Baratheon, this was enormous. To have the future queen come from Storm's End would elevate the Baratheons to a position of unprecedented influence. For Lyonel personally, seeing his daughter become queen would be the culmination of everything his house stood for. But then something happened that would test that friendship in ways no one could have anticipated. In 239 AC, Prince Duncan was traveling through the Riverlands when he met a woman named Jenny of Old Stones. She was a common-born peasant, mysterious and beautiful, and Prince Duncan fell completely and utterly in love with her. And I mean the kind of love that makes you throw away everything. The kind that bards still sing about to this day. Despite his betrothal to Lyonel's daughter, despite his position as heir to the Iron Throne, despite everyone telling him this was madness, Prince Duncan married Jenny then and there. King Aegon did everything in his power to undo the marriage. The High Septon got involved. The Grand Maester weighed in. The entire small council joined together to insist that Aegon force his son to choose between the Iron Throne and his new wife. But Prince Duncan refused. He loved Jenny of Oldstones more than he wanted to be king, so he renounced his claim to the throne in favor of his younger brother Jaehaerys and abdicated as Prince of Dragonstone. Now, here's the thing. Even though Prince Duncan gave up his crown, this did nothing to fix the real problem. Lyonel Baratheon's daughter had been publicly betrothed to the future king of Westeros. Plans had been made, celebrations had been held, the honor of House Baratheon had been tied to this match, and then it was just cast aside for a peasant woman with flowers in her hair. From Lyonel's perspective, and honestly from the perspective of most of the realm, this was an unforgivable insult. The betrothal had brought great honor to House Baratheon. Breaking it brought shame, dishonor, and humiliation. Lyonel's daughter, who had been preparing to become queen, had been rejected. The word would spread throughout Westeros. Other houses would whisper about how House Baratheon had been slighted, how they weren't good enough for the Targaryens after all. For a proud man like Lyonel, someone who had built his reputation on honor and strength, this wounded him deeply. Lyonel's response was dramatic and, given the circumstances, actually quite understandable. He was so enraged that he swore a bloody oath of vengeance. He renounced his fealty to the Iron Throne and declared himself Storm King, proclaiming that the Stormlands had seceded from the Seven Kingdoms. Think about what this means. Lyonel Baratheon became the first Baratheon in history to claim the title of Storm King, and he was the first person to hold that title in nearly 300 years, since King Argilac Durrandon was killed by Orys Baratheon during Aegon's conquest. This wasn't just a tantrum, this was a calculated political move. By declaring himself Storm King, Lyonel was saying that House Baratheon would not be disrespected, that they would not simply accept insults from House Targaryen, and that they had the strength and the will to stand independently. He called his banners, and the lords of the Stormlands answered. A short but bloody rebellion followed. Now, from a modern perspective, you might think Lyonel was overreacting, but in the feudal context of Westeros, honor isn't just about personal feelings, it's about political power. If House Baratheon could be publicly humiliated without consequence, their authority over their vassals would be undermined. Other houses would see them as weak. Future marriage negotiations would be compromised. Lyonel wasn't just defending his pride, he was defending the political standing of his entire house. The rebellion put King Aegon in an impossible position. This was his oldest friend, someone who had fought beside him, someone who had supported him through everything. But Aegon was also the king, and he couldn't allow a major region to simply secede from the realm. The situation needed to be resolved, but how do you fight a war against someone you genuinely care about? The solution came in the form of a trial by combat. Sir Duncan the Tall, now Lord Commander of the King's Guard, stepped forward to be the King's champion against Lord Lyonel. Think about the emotional weight of this moment. Duncan owed Lyonel his life. At the trial of 7, when Duncan was facing death, Lyonel had voluntarily fought beside him. Lyonel had knighted Rhaemund Fossaway, so Duncan would have enough champions. These two men had bled together in one of the most sacred forms of combat in Westerosi culture. But now they stood on opposite sides. Duncan served his king, and his duty demanded that he face his old friend in single combat. For Lyonel, this must have been particularly bitter. The hedge knight he had helped, who had risen to become Lord Commander, was now the instrument of his defeat. The fight itself isn't described in great detail in the sources we have, but we know how it ended. Sir Duncan the Tall defeated Lyonel Baratheon. Now, this is significant for several reasons. First, Duncan was probably past his absolute physical prime at this point, though still one of the greatest warriors in the realm. Lyonel, on the other hand, was still relatively young and in his fighting years. The fact that Duncan won tells us just how skilled he was, but it also tells us that Lyonel, despite his reputation and prowess, was not invincible. But here's what's really important about this combat Lyonel yielded. Duncan didn't kill him. This wasn't a fight to the death. It was a fight until one man surrendered, and Lyonel, recognizing that he had been bested by a superior fighter, yielded the field. This shows something crucial about Lyonel's character. He was a warrior, yes. He was proud, absolutely, but he also understood honor in its truest form. When he was defeated fairly in single combat, he accepted it. He didn't try to fight to the death out of stubborn pride. He recognized reality and yielded. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Because even though Lyonel lost the trial by combat and his rebellion failed, he actually achieved something remarkable. To restore peace, King Aegon agreed to betroth his youngest daughter, Princess Rhaelle Targaryen, to Lyonel's heir, Aegon Baratheon. Think about that. Lyonel started a rebellion because his daughter wasn't going to marry into the royal family. He lost the rebellion, but the peace terms included a royal marriage to House Baratheon anyway. It wasn't exactly what Lyonel had wanted originally. It was Aemond marrying Rhaelle rather than Lyonel's daughter marrying Duncan. But the end result was the same. A Targaryen princess was joining House Baratheon. The honor of the house was restored. The political standing that had been damaged by the broken betrothal was rebuilt. In many ways, this was a strategic victory disguised as a military defeat. As part of the settlement, Princess Rhaelle was sent to Storm's End to serve as Lord Lyonel's cupbearer and as a companion to his lady wife. This was both a gesture of trust and a way to ensure the peace held. Rhaelle would grow up in Storm's End, would learn the ways of House Baratheon, and would eventually marry Aemond in 245 AC, 6 years after the rebellion. And here's the really wild part about this whole story. This marriage between Rhaelle Targaryen and Aemond Baratheon would eventually produce Stephen Baratheon, who would father 3 sons, Robert, Stannis, and Renly. That means Robert Baratheon, the man who would eventually overthrow the Targaryen dynasty, was the great-grandson of both King Aegon the V Targaryen and Lord Lyonel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm. The rebellion that Lyonel started over a broken betrothal created the bloodline that would end Targaryen rule in Westeros nearly 50 years later. You cannot make this stuff up. So what do we make of Lyonel Baratheon? Why should we consider him one of the most underrated warriors in Westeros? Let's break it down. First, his actual combat skills. Lyonel was described as one of the finest fighters of his day. He consistently dominated at tourneys, and his victory over Sir Robert Ashford after breaking 9 lances demonstrates his endurance, skill, and determination. He fought in the Trial of 7 against some of the best knights in the realm and survived. Yes, he eventually lost to Sir Duncan the Tall, but Duncan is consistently portrayed as one of the greatest knights in the history of Westeros. Losing to Duncan isn't a mark against Lyonel, it's a testament to Duncan's exceptional ability. Lyonel was in that top tier of warriors, consistently competitive with the very best. Second, his physical presence. At nearly 7 feet tall and powerfully built, Lyonel had natural advantages that he maximized through training and experience. His signature laugh during combat wasn't just psychological warfare, it was evidence of his confidence and his genuine love for fighting. He wasn't someone who fought out of duty or necessity. He fought because he lived for it, and that passion made him dangerous. Third, his tactical intelligence. The rebellion might seem like a rash emotional decision, but it was actually quite calculated. Lyonel knew that by declaring himself Storm King and forcing a confrontation, he was creating a situation where the crown would have to make concessions. He couldn't actually defeat the Iron Throne militarily. The Stormlands alone couldn't stand against the full might of the 7 kingdoms. But by making enough noise, by causing enough trouble, he could force King Aegon to address the insult to House Baratheon. And it worked. The terms of the peace gave House Baratheon almost everything they wanted. Fourth, his character and honor. Lyonel supported Duncan the Tall when he had nothing to gain from it. He knighted Raymond Fossaway when no one else would. He yielded when he was defeated in fair combat rather than fighting to the death out of pride. He was someone who understood that honor wasn't just about never backing down, it was about recognizing truth and acting accordingly. It's impossible to discuss Lyonel without comparing him to his probable great-grandson, Robert Baratheon. The similarities are striking and deliberate. Both were enormous men, nearly 7 feet tall, powerfully built, with the classic Baratheon features. Both were legendary warriors known for their prowess in combat. Both were favorites of the small folk, charismatic leaders who could inspire loyalty and affection. Both rebelled against Targaryen rule over matters of personal honor, Lyonel over a broken betrothal, Robert over the supposed kidnapping and rape of Lyanna Stark. But there are also important differences. Robert's rebellion succeeded militarily. He actually overthrew the Targaryens and took the throne. Lyonel's rebellion failed militarily, but succeeded politically. Robert's charisma came from his generosity and his ability to make friends. Lyonel's charisma came from his joy in combat and his infectious laughter. Robert became increasingly bitter and dissolute after his rebellion. Lyonel seems to have remained true to his character throughout his life. George R.R. Martin clearly intended for readers to see the connection between these two characters. The text explicitly notes that Robert was considered something of a second coming of Lyonel. The Laughing Storm represents what Robert Baratheon could have been if circumstances had been slightly different, if his rebellion had ended in peace rather than the destruction of a dynasty. So why don't more people talk about Lyonel Baratheon? Why is he considered underrated? A few reasons. First, he appears primarily in the Duncan Egg novellas, which fewer people have read than the main series. Second, he's overshadowed by characters like Duncan the Tall, who are point-of-view characters and thus receive more attention. Third, his story happens a century before the main series, so casual fans might not know about him. And fourth, his greatest achievement, the strategic victory of forcing a royal marriage after losing a rebellion, is subtle and requires some understanding of Westerosi politics to fully appreciate. But those of us who dig deep into the lore understand that Lyonel Baratheon was someone special. He was a warrior who could stand against the best fighters of his generation. He was a lord who understood political maneuvering and wasn't afraid to take enormous risks to defend his house's honor. He was charismatic enough to be loved by the small folk and respected by his peers. He was honorable enough to help a hedge knight he barely knew, yet proud enough to rebel against the king when his house was insulted. Lyonel represents something important in the broader themes of A Song of Ice and Fire. He shows us that reputation and legacy matter in this world. The honor of your house isn't just some abstract concept, it's the foundation of your political power. When that honor is threatened, people will go to extraordinary lengths to defend it, even against their friends, even against the crown itself. The ripple effects of Lyonel's life extend far beyond his own time. His rebellion forced the marriage between Rhaelle Targaryen and Ormond Baratheon, creating the bloodline that would produce Robert, Stannis, and Renly. That Targaryen blood gave Robert a claim to the Iron Throne that helped legitimize his rebellion. Without Lyonel's actions, House Baratheon might never have had that connection to the Targaryens, and Robert's rebellion might have played out very differently. Moreover, Lyonel's story illustrates important themes about friendship, loyalty, and honor that run throughout the series. His friendship with Aegon V and Duncan the Tall shows how personal relationships formed in youth can shape political realities decades later. His willingness to fight against his friends when his honor demanded it shows the tension between personal affection and feudal obligation that so many characters in the main series grapple with. The trial by combat between Lyonel and Duncan also provides important context for later trials by combat in the series. It shows that these aren't just spectacles or formalities, they're serious matters with real political consequences. When Tyrion demands trial by combat, or when the Hound fights Beric Dondarrion, they're participating in the same tradition that saw the Laughing Storm face off against the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. For those excited about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Lyonel Baratheon is going to be a significant character. He's being portrayed by Daniel Ings, and based on the source material, we should see both his performance at the tourney at Ashford and his participation in the Trial of Seven. This is going to be our chance to see the Laughing Storm in action, to hear that booming laugh, to watch him knock the crest off opponents' helms and fling them to the crowd. If the show continues beyond the first season, there's potential to explore Lyonel's later years as Lord of Storm's End and possibly even his rebellion and trial by combat against Duncan. That would be incredible television, the two friends forced to fight each other because of conflicting loyalties and wounded honor. The showrunners have said they want to be faithful to Martin's vision, and Lyonel is too important to the story to be left out or diminished. One thing I'm particularly excited about is seeing how they portray the relationship between Lyonel, Duncan and Egg. That friendship is at the heart of the Dunk and Egg stories, and Lyonel is a crucial part of it. His willingness to fight for Duncan at the Trial of Seven, despite barely knowing him, is such a powerful moment. It shows that even in a world as cynical and brutal as Westeros, there are people who will stand up for what's right simply because it's right. Lyonel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm, was one of the finest warriors of his age, a lord who balanced honor with political acumen, and a man whose laughter on the battlefield became legendary. He fought in one of the most famous trials of Seven in history. He rebelled against the crown and forced them to negotiate despite losing militarily. He created the Bloodline that would eventually overthrow the dynasty he fought against. And through it all, he remained true to himself, laughing at his opponents, fighting with joy, and defending his house's honor no matter the cost. In a series full of morally gray characters and people motivated by ambition or revenge, Lyonel stands out as someone who genuinely seemed to enjoy life. He fought because he loved fighting. He laughed because combat filled him with joy. He rebelled not out of ambition, but to defend his daughter's honor and his house's reputation. He yielded when he was fairly defeated because his honor demanded it. He's underrated precisely because his motivations are so straightforward in a series where everyone else has layers upon layers of hidden agendas. So the next time someone asks you about the greatest warriors in Westeros, don't just mention the obvious names like Arthur Dayne or Barristan Selmy. Remember the Laughing Storm, Lyonel Baratheon, the man who was nearly 7 feet tall, who knocked cress into the crowd for the small folk, who rebelled against the king and somehow won despite losing, and whose laughter echoed across the battlefields of the Stormlands. He deserves to be remembered, and I hope this video helps do that. That's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Lyonel Baratheon, please hit that like button and subscribe for more Song of Ice and Fire content. I've got videos on other underrated characters, political analyses of various houses, and breakdowns of upcoming shows planned. Drop a comment below letting me know who you'd like to see covered next. There are so many fascinating characters in this universe that deserve more attention. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Ours is the Fury.